So welcome back to my channel, and I'm really happy to be interviewing else today. It is Talal Hangari, and we met on Twitter, right?
Yes, that's right.
So tell everyone who you are.
So I got involved with left politics kind of towards the end of the Corbyn project. I joined the Labour Party just before the 2019 general election, and I was really enthusiastic, really hopeful. And from there, I kind of got involved with left politics more broadly, and I started researching and learning about the left. And what I liked from following your Twitter account was kind of the critique and trying to learn from that period of the left in power and what's happened since.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's what we're kind of trying to do today, isn't it? Like try to look at that period. So the period that I was really involved, so 2015 to 2019, which kind of just is the bit that you're kind of looking at from the outside as not having been a member then, and see what we can learn. So I think we should start with like why we're, I mean, a lot of people say, like, why don't you just give up talking about the anti-Semitism, right? And so maybe we should start with why we're not going to give up talking about it.
Yeah, so one good reason why we need to keep speaking about it is because it keeps turning up in the mainstream press, in television interviews. People keep insisting that if Corbyn himself was not an anti-Semite, although many people do say he's an anti-Semite and a racist, but even if he wasn't himself an anti-Semite, that left movement was really a hateful movement. It was inspired by bigotry. And, you know, apart from the historical record and pointing out that that just isn't true, I think it's important for the left just to have some self-confidence and to be assertive about the fact that we are trying to be a positive movement. And, you know, our goal is to transform society for the better.
Yeah, I think you're right about that confidence. Even for me and you, I think like we're very certain about what happened and the fact that none of us are, you know, anti-Semitic, and in the way that was portrayed, Jeremy Corbyn is anti-Semitic, the movement's not anti-Semitic. It just wears you down, being told it all the time, right, and having to fight it all the time.
Yes, I mean, it's really, I think the main negative effect of the anti-Semitism allegations against the Labour Party wasn't on kind of an electoral level, but it was really the division that it caused inside the left and the demoralization. That was the real core of the harm that happened. And I still don't think the left has fully come to grips with that. I think we're still trying to recover.
Yeah, I agree. Totally. And we were talking over Twitter and also just before we started this interview about one of the guys who's going for the leadership of the NEU union, the National Education Union, and he's on the left. He supported Jeremy Corbyn, and he's now being labelled an anti-Semite in the press.
Yes, I mean, so there's this Daily Mail article about a tweet that has been deleted, in which I think he's apologized for, where they tried to paint him as an anti-Semite. And there is an irony there, which is the fact that every day in the right-wing press, you can read new articles about cancel culture, the scourge of the woke left who are destroying liberal society and liberal values. And yet somehow, whenever someone appears who wants to challenge the class hierarchy in Britain and corporate power, they're open season to smear, open season, whatever you want to say. And none of the right-wing free speech defenders seem to really have a problem with that.
Yeah, and of course there's irony in these articles as well. In the articles next to this one, there'll be like really racist stuff happening. Yeah, it's very depressing. But yeah, it's still having a huge effect on who the leadership of the left is, on what we do, how we think about ourselves. So, okay, so that's why we're still talking about it. Let's go back to what are the key mistakes. So what would you say? How would you characterize the mistakes the left made?
When Corbyn and the Labour leadership started to see that they were being divulged? No, sorry. Started to see that they were being deluged with these accusations. They had a couple of options for how they could have responded. So one was to appease, and that was the strategy that they went with, just to say, look, we're dealing with the problem. We kicked out so-and-so. We adopted X, Y, and Z. We're dealing with the problem. And what did that lead to in the end? I mean, it's led to Corbyn himself now being suspended from the party under Keir Starmer's leadership, led to many people being kicked out on flimsy pretenses, and it led to all kinds of demoralization. The other option, what I think would have had merit as a strategy, would have been to respond decisively and based on the facts that these allegations are being exaggerated, that the Labour Party is not full of anti-Semites, that we are actually a party of social justice and want to transform society for the better. And frankly, that there's a lot of irony that the same press and the same political establishment in Britain that is complicit in horrific racism in all kinds of ways is making these allegations about people like Corbyn, who have a decades-long record of standing with minorities, oppressed communities. And frankly, I think it would have been good if Corbyn had stood up and said, you know, where were you during the anti-apartheid struggle against South African apartheid? Where have you been on the streets marching against fascism? Because, you know, my own inclination is to believe that most of the people who are going after him, you probably would struggle to find having much of a record, or at least a comparable record to what Corbyn has, you know.
Yeah. So why do you think that didn't happen? So my feeling is that it became impossible to pursue that strategy at a certain point because the movement wasn't behind that strategy. That there were people putting forward that strategy. I mean, Jewish Voice for Labour put forward that strategy. Some other left-wing groups did. Some individual voices did. Some experts in the field did. But the majority of the left who had backed Corbyn wouldn't have been behind that strategy and weren't behind that strategy.
Yes, I mean, in my opinion, this relates to the left's weakness on a few issues. One is the issue of freedom of expression. And I think another is the related issue of identity politics. And I think how sometimes identity politics is used cynically to undermine, especially the left, because it's the left which is really sensitive to the needs of, you know, minorities and people who have been historically oppressed and so on. And so those attacks have a special kind of potency, I think, against the left. Whereas if you call the right racist, Boris Johnson just laughs and it just, you know,
Yes.
it's just kind of deflected.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe we should talk a little bit about each of those. So freedom of speech then.
Yeah, so first of all, I think as a general principle, it's right for the left to defend freedom of expression, not just as a liberty that we want to protect from government interference, because usually the left is quite good on issues like clamping down on protest, government intervention with civil liberties. Usually the left is pretty good on those. Where the left is not so good is freedom of speech as a value, I think. Freedom of speech as a kind of ethos. So in an organization, generally speaking, the principle should be free debate, free discussion. If we have a dispute, we talk about it as comrades, and we treat this as kind of our main method for finding the truth. I think that is the general principle. Now, if you ask me about the Labour Party in particular, I think one of the problems that people have when they think about this question of free speech is they don't realize quite how broad free speech already is in the Labour Party. So what can you say in the Labour Party? Let's just take a few examples. You can say that you support arms sales to Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is prosecuting a murderous war in Yemen. Yeah. Civilians are getting killed, bombed, and starved. As a Labour Party member, I think Luke Akehurst has publicly said that he supports arms sales to Saudi Arabia. You're allowed to support that. So that's one. Let's take another example. How about Labour Friends of Israel? There's a complete agreement in the human rights establishment, I guess, the human rights sphere, that Israel is practicing the crime of apartheid. That's what Human Rights Watch thinks. That's what Amnesty International thinks. That's what B'Tselem thinks. Now, Labour MPs are allowed to have an organization called Labour Friends of Israel, where they organize to essentially promote Israel's interests and to promote British-Israeli relations without any kind of repercussions, despite the fact that Israel is practicing this crime against humanity. So that's also perfectly fine, Labour Party.
Yeah.
So we really kind of have to wonder when these tweets and Facebook posts or whatever else are being culled off the internet, where's the kind of principle where you decide, okay, we're going to censor this? Because to me, it just seems completely incoherent.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to explain to someone a couple of days ago who's been a Labour Party member for ages, used to be a councillor, that I'd been expelled, and he couldn't understand it. And I said what I was expelled for saying that anti-Semitism has been weaponized against the left and used as a smear. And he said, but that's true. How can you get expelled? And he said, can you rejoin? And I was like, no, I've been expelled. It was like almost beyond his comprehension that could be used, because you're right, it's so completely inconsistent. And yeah, I mean, the whole kind of assault on free speech started under Jeremy Corbyn in ways that were just made to sort of manage the damage, and then has been taken up in a massive way under Keir Starmer, with goalposts moved all the time, so you don't even know what you're allowed to say and where you're allowed to say it. Yeah, so let's go to identity politics, which is the other thing you think was the kind of reason why that appeasement became the strategy rather than a more kind of strident approach to the anti-Semitism smears.
Yeah, so identity politics, it's a complicated issue, and I think it does require some nuance to kind of understand it fully. But I think there is kind of a inclination that many people on the left have to essentially say that whatever a group says about, for example, its experiences or its feelings about a topic has to be taken as not just a consideration, not just a concern, but kind of as an almost incontestable fact. And I think, although, I would consider that to be an irrational position, that's many people's instinct. And understandably sometimes, because, you do sometimes have historic examples of oppression where people have not been listened to and so forth. And so the left's instinct is, well, we should take these things seriously. But at the same time, this opens a vulnerability, because now whatever anyone says about the left, it must be true. If to take a example from the United States, Bernie Sanders in his campaign faced similar kinds of condemnation, not of the same scale, but based on, again, identity politics. So Sanders was accused of being weak on race issues, for example, and his supporters were sometimes called the Bernie Bros, which was supposed to mean that they were all sexist and bullying and so on. And really, I think we just need to be able to see through these things. And we just need to be able to say, look, this stuff, it doesn't really have any real basis. And so, although we are definitely concerned about, lifting up everyone in society and fighting for the rights of everyone in society, we can't allow ourselves to be kind of derailed by bad faith accusations.
Yeah, I think for me, there has to be like a real interrogation of the structures around those, around different identity politics. So my inclination is always to believe women who talk about sexual harassment, rape, and so on, because the structures around women's experiences of those mean that it's very difficult to speak about it publicly, mean that the people who perpetrate these crimes and these forms of harassment, particularly in the workplace, but more generally, are protected by different networks. And so that kind of structural understanding biases me towards believing. And I think that's a rational way of responding. I think what happens is there was a lack of understanding of the structures around allegations of anti-Semitism, experiences of anti-Semitism, which meant that people couldn't judge and assess those claims in the way that they needed to. So, for example, there's a lot of times a kind of confusion, I think, in anti-Semitism between something that makes a Jewish person feel uncomfortable, or that makes most Jewish people feel uncomfortable, and something which is anti-Semitic. And there's been a slippage towards, well, if it makes someone uncomfortable, we shouldn't say it. And lack of understanding of how that slippage works, whose interests it protects, how that relates to other forms of racism, to Islamophobia, to anti-Palestinian racism. That understanding was just missing. And so I think it's a very kind of simplistic and reductive approach to identity politics, which is the problem.
Yeah, I think, anyone who had been involved extensively with the Palestine solidarity movement would have had a kind of much more skeptical view. And in fact, that's what I think we see. I think the people who are the most skeptical were usually the people who had experience of the Palestine solidarity movement and knew or were familiar with these tactics of kind of silencing and censorship. So it does still kind of confuse me, I suppose, sometimes when I think about Corbyn and some of the veterans of his team, why they didn't kind of catch on, I guess, or maybe they did and they felt they had no choice. But either way, I would have expected, people with that level of political experience to be much, much more skeptical. So it's just unfortunate what happened, I guess.
Yeah, understatement of the century, right? Yeah, it's unfortunate. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the IHRA definition. So the IHRA, or sometimes the IHRA definition, is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, and it is a tool which is used by people who support Israel to increasingly conflate any form of criticism of Israel's policies or structures or systems of apartheid, or even of occupation, with anti-Semitism, to make it seem like there's really no difference between these two. So in terms of what you're saying, though, it was really Jeremy Corbyn and Seamus Milne who held out the longest on this. It was people around those two who collapsed. So to be fair to Jeremy and Seamus, they did get it, I think, on that. They understood how it would be used. And even when the battle had been lost, Jeremy was still going to the National Executive Committee saying, please, can we have a little amendment to this to make sure people's free speech is protected? And the NEC said no to him. So can you talk a bit about that? Because you got really caught up in the IHRA thing where you were at university as well. So you have like really direct experience of that.
So the IHRA definition, to anyone who looks at its origins and its usage, I don't see how you can view it as anything other than a tool of censorship. So anyone who has actually done the digging, and thankfully for us, Jamie Stern-Weiner has, in a report that he wrote called The Politics of a Definition, it's very, very obvious that the IHRA, and in particular its examples, is a tool of censorship. So we kind of have this problem. Why did the Labour Party give in to adopting an obvious tool of censorship? And I think the answer is just, they thought, if we adopt this, all the accusations and the continued hysteria might decline, or might be slowed for a bit, or we might be able to say, look, we actually did do this. A paradigmatic example, Ash Sarkar, when she wrote an article, courageously at the time, but when she wrote an article criticizing the IHRA definition, she did have this caveat towards the beginning, I think, where she said, it's necessary for Labour to adopt some version of the definition to restore Jewish trust in the party. Those were her words. So this idea, some version was going to be enough, very naive. It wasn't going to be enough until Labour adopted all the examples and the whole definition without qualifications. It was always going to be savaged and attacked if it didn't do that. So I think really it was a obvious error. And many people pointed this out at the time. But it also connects more broadly to questions of free speech, because I think the alternative would have been to argue for broad anti-racist principles, that Labour would not adopt any particular definitions, but would, generally speaking, stand against racism as a united struggle of all different groups. And that, I think, would have been a more effective response.
So the kind of Owen Jones position is that the mistake was not to adopt it sooner, that actually it could have calmed things down if it had been adopted sooner, but because it wasn't, things got really messy and there was no possibility of restoring faith in the party after that. What's your kind of response to that?
Right, so we have to come back to the purpose of the definition. So once you've adopted it, let's say earlier rather than later, what do you have? Well, now Labour has a tool of censorship. And anyone who wants can go through social media posts, tweets, whatever, and they can say, well, doesn't this tweet violate the IHRA definition? I mean, doesn't it look like this statement by Corbyn could violate the IHRA definition? Doesn't it look like if members talk about this in their CLP, that could be a violation of the IHRA definition? So you can see how it's just setting up a horrible precedent, whether you adopt it earlier or later. Example, even Amnesty's report has been cited as violating the IHRA definition because it's been said to treat the founding of Israel as a racist endeavor. Yeah. So, you know, potentially under the tool of censorship that Labour has adopted, people sharing or engaging with the Amnesty International report on apartheid in Israel, that could be seen as anti-Semitic, right? So I think Owen Jones needs to kind of deal with the fact that the instrument, the IHRA instrument, is fundamentally flawed. It doesn't really matter whether you delay or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to, I guess, prescribe Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, pretty much any international human rights body that if anyone has any connections with those, the International Criminal Court, that's anti-Semitic, isn't it? United Nations is anti-Semitic. And I think it's difficult now because people who've gone as far as they have down that Owen Jones momentum route now find it very difficult to actually engage with the truth of what happened. I don't know how we get past this, and I don't know where we are now. Maybe this is a good time to switch to like the state of the left and state of the Labour left. So let's start with the Labour left. What do you think of the Labour left as part of it?
Yes, I actually just want to add briefly before we come on to this. I was personally permanently expelled from my Labour club at university because I wrote an article criticizing the IHRA definition. So all the people, that's just an example for people who might think nobody really seriously has ever been censored over the IHRA. So that's one thing. But coming to the Labour left, I have very little hope at this point. First of all, the Labour left seems to have very little understanding of the historic crisis that it's facing at this time. It doesn't have any strategy because it doesn't understand that crisis. And there's no reason to expect that in the future, the near future, there will be any change. So unfortunately, I'm forced to conclude that at this time, the Labour left is dead. Okay,
so let's talk about that. That's a big judgment, because previously when I've spoken to you, you've been putting we should stay in the Labour Party and test out the stay and fight strategy. And now you're saying that that's not viable. There is no stay and fight strategy because there's not an understanding of the crisis. The crisis being that we can't even put forward a left agenda within the party anymore, that we can't even pose. Is that right?
Yes. So the state of free expression and kind of the ability to do politics, the fundamentals of doing politics, that's just kind of been destroyed in the Labour Party. So really, you're on a path to destruction as far as Labour left is concerned, because you don't even have the rudimentary fundamentals to do politics. You don't have your ability to speak. You don't have your ability to really organize. So for that reason, I would say, I don't think, just to be clear, I still think on a theoretical level, let's say logical possibility, it's logically possible to unite on the Labour left and fight proscription. It seems to be, by the laws of nature or physical laws, it just seems to be impossible. There doesn't seem to be any sign that official left groups like Momentum or the Socialist Campaign Group will do anything. And my impression is, even if Corbyn is completely booted out of the party, and which is a very strong possibility, nothing will really happen. Some people will release some statements saying this is really horrible, and then they'll go back on autopilot. So I'm very, very skeptical. What kind of demands and program I've suggested to the Labour left, I've only really put down just to have on the record now, because no one is going to take that kind of agenda up. No one's going to pay any attention to it.
I'm going to try and put a slightly counter position, just for the sake of argument. I can see very interesting things happening in a few councils. So Worthing Council is a Corbynista council that came into power through the Corbyn period. I mean, they actually got control just afterwards in the most recent local elections, but they gained seats through the activism of the Corbyn time, and they gained the energy within the party there. And the councillors now are putting that agenda forward. And I think Wandsworth is very interesting. I mean, they've got probably the most left-wing member of that Labour group as the person in charge of housing. And he is saying 100% council housing on public land. He's saying some quite radical things. He's saying we really need to take seriously balloting on estates, and not just use it as a tick box, but actually engage people, actually find out what people want, and actually try and implement it and do it with people. He's restoring lifetime tenancies in council properties, things like that. So could there not be, does that not suggest there is some possibilities there?
obviously it's good to see people are working at the local level to try to improve things in their community. And it's good to see that there are some labor councils with a kind of left-wing color to them, I guess. But the problem is you have no guarantee. And in fact, you have a very strong likelihood of that project just being put to an end without any control from your point of view. So if you take local councils, there's really no strong reason to believe that you're going to have a fair selection process as a local candidate if you're on the left. And the party bureaucracy has already shown in even more important selections like MP selections that you're not going to get a fair hearing. So as far as those local projects, I can't see them having a long life, really. And this is why fundamentally the purges are the issue. You can control however many CLPs you want. You can have momentum members in the chairs of however many CLPs. It's not going to mean that you can have a left-wing candidate. It's just not, because someone from regional office is going to intervene and say, well, you remember, that tweet from 7 years ago? Now you're not, or, not a tweet. Remember that like from 7 years ago? Yeah, you're out of the race, that's it. And I really am skeptical, unless, people take the purges seriously. But again, I don't expect that to happen. And it should have happened a long time ago if it was going to happen. And I think people should be paying attention, but they aren't. They're kind of sleepwalking into just getting kicked out.
Okay, so you're still a member of the Labour Party. So why are you still a member of the Labour Party when the Labour left is dead?
I'm still a member of the Labour Party. I don't recommend my lifestyle to anyone. No, I mean, I kind of don't any longer participate very much in my local party. But now I don't give anyone advice on this question. I think it's completely up to you, kind of what you want to do. What I will say is, I think a lot of the energy on the left in coming months and years is not going to be found in the Labour Party. It's going to be found outside the Labour Party in various forms. But really the Labour left, as I see it, is stagnant at this time. And maybe it won't always be stagnant. These things aren't permanent judgments that we make. They change based on circumstances. And maybe there will be a time in the future when the Labour left will become an energetic place to be again. But at this moment, I don't tell anyone to stay or to leave. It's just kind of a personal decision.
But so what does it do for you being in the Labour Party, and why, I mean, given your judgment on it, given your feeling of despondency around it, what do you get out of it?
I don't get anything. I think it's partly a sense of the people that you have been working alongside. You feel maybe some sense of responsibility to them, or you might feel some sense of community still within, people make friends in their CLPs and all of this stuff. But really, I wouldn't say politically I'm gaining very much. And I expect that I will be thrown out pretty soon. And why I haven't been thrown out, I don't know. But we'll see, I guess, what the future will be. Yeah, if you really want to get thrown out, you should apply to be a councillor. That's the fast track to expulsion, right? Yeah. Then they can go through my whole Twitter and we can find all the evidence. Yeah, no, I get where you're coming from though, because I miss a lot of things about being in Labour Party. I miss a sense of community, and I have got it through other smaller campaigns. And in my branch, we meet once a month still, the left wing members only, and generally none of us are going to the branch meetings. I
think 1 or 2 people might still be members technically, but they're in the process of lapsing. And that's been really nice, but it takes effort to organize these things outside. So maybe we should end with, like, do you have any thoughts on what we should be doing outside the party, how we should be organizing?
My own feeling has moved quite a bit over time, but I think it's a necessity to build a socialist party that can challenge the establishment and British capitalism, and actually have an even more radical program than what we had with Corbyn, and start to build support for that kind of program. But that obviously is not an easy task, and it takes many people coming together and kind of overcoming the sectarianism, which is already a problem on the left, as we all know if we spend any time involved with the left. So that's my own feeling, although there's a lot of debate about this question. And what I would encourage people to do is to read some of the literature which has been written about either reflecting on Corbynism or thinking about the future, thinking about strategy. I think people on the left now generally should be getting themselves into a strategic mindset about where do we go from here. And a good way to provoke thoughts is to read some of the recent books that have been written. I recently finished James Schneider's book on strategy, which I have many disagreements with, but it's good anyway. I mean, it will get you thinking, hopefully. And I encourage people to kind of get in that mode of thinking.
That's nice. Okay, that's a positive way to end. I'm going to put in the description box below this video link to that book and to the other things we talked about, to your account of what happened to you in your University Labour Club, for example, to an article you've written recently. It covers a lot of these areas. It covers a lot of the kind of issues about freedom of speech on the left. And it would be really nice to get a discussion going. I will put our @ on Twitter. So if you're on Twitter, you can chat to us there. And if you're not on Twitter, you can obviously comment in the boxes below. There's a comment section, and both of us will try and come back and answer those questions and respond to the thoughts people have, because like you say, it's really important for us to be talking about this.